Turn around. What are you doing here?
This is my home. I just got back from work. Here's my keys and ID.
ID? Where were you? Anyone to verify you?
I live here. You have no probable cause. What crime am I suspected of?
Step away from the car!
The blue and red lights started flashing at exactly 9:42 p.m. on a quiet Tuesday evening in what was supposed to be one of the safest neighborhoods in the entire city. Judge Mark Smith had just pulled into his own driveway after a long day presiding over criminal cases at the federal courthouse downtown. He was tired, looking forward to a quiet dinner with his wife, and completely unaware that the next 15 minutes would change his life forever and expose a shocking pattern of behavior that had been hidden for years. What happened next was captured on multiple cameras, witnessed by several neighbors, and would eventually lead to consequences that nobody could have predicted. This wasn't just another case of mistaken identity or a simple misunderstanding. This was about power, assumptions, and what happens when someone with a badge thinks they can intimidate the wrong person. Judge Mark Smith was 52 years old and had spent the last 8 years on the federal bench. Before becoming a judge, he worked as a prosecutor for 12 years, putting away some of the most dangerous criminals in the state. He lived in Willowbrook Heights, an upscale suburban neighborhood where most of his neighbors were doctors, lawyers, and business executives. His house sat on a corner lot with a circular driveway, perfectly manicured lawn, and a 2-car garage. That Tuesday had been particularly exhausting. Judge Smith had presided over a complex fraud case that lasted all day, listened to hours of testimony, and made several critical rulings that would affect the lives of everyone involved. All he wanted was to get home, kiss his wife hello, and maybe catch up on some reading before bed. Nothing about his routine suggested drama or confrontation. Officer Danny Rodriguez was 28 years old and had been with the police department for exactly 4 months. He was still in his probationary period, still learning the ropes, still trying to prove himself to his supervisors and fellow officers. What nobody knew was that Rodriguez had already received 2 complaints during his short tenure, both involving what witnesses described as aggressive behavior during routine traffic stops. Rodriguez was patrolling the Willowbrook Heights area that evening, driving slowly through the quiet streets lined with expensive homes and luxury cars. The neighborhood was known for being peaceful, with very little crime and even fewer police calls. Most officers considered it an easy assignment, a chance to cruise around and maybe write a few speeding tickets. But Rodriguez wasn't like most officers. He had developed what he called instincts about people and situations, though what he really had were biases and assumptions that he had never been properly trained to recognize or control. When he saw Judge Smith's black Mercedes pulling into the driveway of the corner house, something in his mind clicked. A well-dressed black man driving an expensive car in this neighborhood triggered every stereotype Rodriguez had been carrying around in his head. Judge Smith parked in his usual spot, gathered his briefcase and jacket from the passenger seat, and stepped out of his car. The motion sensor lights illuminated his driveway, casting long shadows across the pavement. He was wearing a dark suit, white dress shirt, and a burgundy tie that he had loosened during the drive home. Everything about him screamed professional, successful, respectable. Rodriguez made a U-turn and pulled up to the curb directly in front of Judge Smith's house. He activated his emergency lights, creating those familiar red and blue flashes that immediately drew the attention of neighbors in nearby houses. Several people peered out their windows, wondering what could possibly be happening in their quiet neighborhood. Judge Smith noticed the police car immediately, but didn't think much of it. Police cars occasionally patrolled the area, and sometimes officers would park for a few minutes to write reports or take calls. He continued walking toward his front door, keys in hand, when he heard a car door slam behind him. Officer Rodriguez approached with his hand resting on his utility belt, walking with the kind of aggressive swagger that rookie cops sometimes develop when they think they need to assert authority. His voice carried across the quiet evening air as he called out for Judge Smith to stop and turn around. Judge Smith stopped, confused but compliant. He had spent enough years in the criminal justice system to know that the smartest thing to do was follow instructions and ask questions later. He turned around slowly, keeping his hands visible, and asked the officer if there was a problem. Rodriguez didn't introduce himself properly or explain why he had stopped. Instead, He immediately demanded to know what Judge Smith was doing in the neighborhood. The question was so absurd that Judge Smith almost laughed. He was standing in his own driveway, at his own house, with his keys in his hand, and this officer was asking what he was doing here. Judge Smith calmly explained that he lived here, that this was his house, and that he had just come home from work. Rodriguez looked skeptical, his eyes scanning the expensive house, and then back to Judge Smith. He asked to see identification, which Judge Smith provided without argument. Rodriguez studied the driver's license for a long time, comparing the photo to Judge Smith's face, checking the address against the house number. Everything matched perfectly, but instead of apologizing and leaving, Rodriguez became more suspicious. He asked Judge Smith what kind of work he did, where he had been that evening, and whether anyone could verify his story. The questions were becoming increasingly inappropriate and invasive, but Judge Smith remained calm and professional. He explained that he worked downtown, that he had just finished a long day at the office, and that his wife was inside the house if the officer needed verification. What he didn't tell Rodriguez was exactly what his job was, because he wanted to see how far this officer would take things. Rodriguez asked Judge Smith to step away from the car and put his hands on the hood. This request crossed a major line. There was no reasonable suspicion of criminal activity, no justification for a search or detention, and certainly no grounds for treating a homeowner like a criminal suspect in his own driveway. Judge Smith had reached his limit. In his calm but authoritative courtroom voice, he asked Rodriguez to explain the legal basis for the detention. He asked what crime Rodriguez suspected him of committing. He asked why he was being treated like a suspect when he had done nothing wrong and was standing on his own property. Rodriguez didn't like being questioned. In his mind, citizens were supposed to comply with whatever officers asked, regardless of whether those requests were legal or appropriate. He raised his voice and told Judge Smith that he was conducting an investigation and that failure to cooperate could result in arrest. This was Rodriguez's first major mistake. Threatening to arrest someone without probable cause is not only illegal, it's the kind of behavior that ends careers and results in expensive lawsuits. But Rodriguez was too inexperienced and too caught up in his own authority to recognize the dangerous ground he was walking on. Judge Smith pulled out his cell phone and announced that he was going to record the interaction. Rodriguez immediately ordered him to put the phone away, claiming it was interfering with a police investigation. Judge Smith calmly informed the officer that he had every legal right to record a police encounter on his own property. The situation was escalating quickly, and neither man knew that several neighbors had already started recording from their windows. Mrs. Patterson, who lived directly across the street, had been watching the entire encounter and was filming with her tablet. The Johnsons, who lived next door, were recording from their upstairs bedroom window. What was happening in Judge Smith's driveway was being documented from multiple angles. Rodriguez's supervisor, Sergeant Patricia Williams, received the call at 9:58 p.m. A concerned neighbor had phoned the police department to report what appeared to be an inappropriate detention happening in their neighborhood. Mrs. Patterson had been watching the interaction unfold and was disturbed by what she was seeing. She told the dispatcher that an officer was harassing a man in his own driveway for no apparent reason. Sergeant Williams had been with the department for 15 years and had seen her share of problematic officers. When she heard the address and realized it was Rodriguez involved, her heart sank. She had been keeping a close eye on the rookie officer after the previous complaints, and this call immediately raised red flags. She radioed Rodriguez to get a status update on his location and activities. Rodriguez's response was evasive and confusing. He claimed he was investigating suspicious activity in the Willowbrook Heights area, but couldn't provide specific details about what made the activity suspicious. When Sergeant Williams asked for more information, Rodriguez became defensive and insisted he had the situation under control. Meanwhile, Judge Smith continued recording while maintaining his composure. He had prosecuted enough cases to know that everything happening right now was being documented, and that documentation would be crucial if this situation continued to deteriorate. He spoke clearly into his phone's camera, stating his name, the date and time, his address, and describing what was happening. Rodriguez was becoming increasingly agitated by Judge Smith's calm demeanor and legal knowledge. Most people Rodriguez had encountered during his short career became nervous or intimidated when confronted by police authority. Judge Smith's confidence and articulate responses were throwing him off his game and making him feel like he was losing control of the situation. The officer decided to escalate further. He told Judge Smith that he smelled marijuana coming from his person and that this gave him probable cause to conduct a search. This was another lie, another violation of Rodriguez's oath and training. There was no marijuana smell because Judge Smith didn't use drugs, but Rodriguez was grasping for any justification to continue his harassment. Judge Smith looked directly at Rodriguez and calmly stated that the officer was lying. He said it clearly and without emotion, the same way he might rule on an objection in his courtroom. The accusation hung in the air between them, and Rodriguez's face flushed with anger and embarrassment. That's when Rodriguez made his biggest mistake of the evening. He grabbed Judge Smith's arm and told him he was under arrest for obstruction of justice and possession of controlled substances. The charges were completely fabricated, with no evidence to support either claim, but Rodriguez was now too deep into his own deception to back down. Judge Smith did not resist the arrest, but he continued recording and speaking clearly for the camera. He stated that he was being unlawfully arrested in his own driveway, that no crime had been committed, and that the officer had no probable cause for detention or search. His voice remained steady and professional, even as handcuffs were placed on his wrists. Mrs. Patterson couldn't stay silent any longer. She walked out of her house and approached the scene, her tablet still recording. She called out to Rodriguez, asking why he was arresting her neighbor. Rodriguez turned toward her and ordered her to go back inside. But Mrs. Patterson stood her ground. She told him she had been recording everything and that she knew Judge Smith personally. Rodriguez asked Mrs. Patterson how she knew the suspect. She looked at him with disbelief and said that Judge Smith wasn't a suspect. He was a federal judge who lived in the house behind him and was one of the most respected people in the entire neighborhood. She said she had watched him come home from work the same way hundreds of times before. The color drained from Rodriguez's face. A federal judge. He had just arrested a federal judge in the judge's own driveway on completely fabricated charges. Every instinct told him to release Judge Smith immediately and try to make this go away, but he was already in too deep. The arrest had been made, the handcuffs were on, and multiple people were recording everything. Sergeant Williams arrived at the scene at 10:07 p.m., exactly 25 minutes after the initial stop. She took one look at the situation and immediately knew her worst fears had been realized. Rodriguez stood next to a handcuffed black man in an expensive suit, while neighbors gathered around recording the encounter. The body language and tension in the air told her everything she needed to know. She approached Rodriguez first and asked for a private word. They walked a few steps away from Judge Smith, though not far enough to avoid the recording devices. Williams asked Rodriguez to explain exactly what had happened and what charges he was planning to file. Rodriguez's explanation was rambling and inconsistent, filled with vague references to suspicious behavior and drug possession that he couldn't substantiate. Williams looked at Judge Smith, still standing calmly in handcuffs, and something about his demeanor told her this was not an ordinary citizen. She had dealt with thousands of arrestees over her career, and this man carried himself differently. There was an authority and confidence that suggested someone accustomed to being respected and listened to. She walked over to Judge Smith and introduced herself properly, something Rodriguez had failed to do. She asked for his name and occupation, and when Judge Smith identified himself as a federal judge, Williams closed her eyes and took a deep breath. This was about to become the worst night of Rodriguez's career and potentially her own. Judge Smith remained professional even while handcuffed. He explained calmly what had happened, from the moment Rodriguez approached him until the present. He mentioned the recording he had made, the witnesses who had observed everything, and his concern that the officer had violated numerous department policies and constitutional rights. Williams immediately ordered Rodriguez to remove the handcuffs. Rodriguez hesitated, still clinging to his false narrative about probable cause and drug possession. Williams raised her voice and made it clear that this was not a request. The handcuffs came off, and Judge Smith rubbed his wrists where the metal had dug into his skin. The neighbors who had gathered were not satisfied with simply removing the handcuffs. They had watched the entire encounter, and several were demanding answers about why their neighbor had been treated this way. The Johnsons approached and introduced themselves as character witnesses, explaining that Judge Smith was an exemplary neighbor who had lived in the community for years without any problems. Williams found herself in an impossible situation. She had a rookie officer who had clearly violated policy and possibly broken the law, a federal judge who had been unlawfully arrested, multiple witnesses with video evidence, and a growing crowd of angry neighbors. Every decision she made from this point forward would be scrutinized and could affect her own career. She asked Judge Smith if he wanted to file a formal complaint against Officer Rodriguez. Judge Smith said he would be filing multiple complaints through various channels, including the police department's Internal Affairs Division, the Civilian Oversight Board, and potentially federal authorities if civil rights violations were determined to have occurred. Rodriguez finally began to understand the magnitude of what he had done. A federal judge wasn't just any citizen. This was someone with intimate knowledge of the law, connections throughout the justice system, and the credibility to pursue serious consequences. His hands were shaking as he realized his career in law enforcement was probably over before it had really begun. Judge Smith walked into his house at 10:15 p.m., nearly 35 minutes after what should have been a simple arrival home from work. His wife, Sarah, was waiting in the living room, having watched most of the encounter through their front window. She had been recording as well, her phone capturing everything from inside the house as backup to the multiple neighbor recordings. Sarah Smith was a retired prosecutor herself, and she immediately understood the legal implications of what had just occurred. She had watched her husband handle the situation with remarkable restraint, but she could see the anger and frustration in his eyes now that they were alone. This wasn't just about one officer's poor judgment. This was about a pattern of behavior that needed to be exposed and stopped. Judge Smith sat down at his kitchen table and began writing detailed notes while everything was still fresh in his memory. He documented exact times, direct quotes from Officer Rodriguez, the names of witnesses, and his own responses throughout the encounter. He had learned during his years as a prosecutor that cases were won and lost based on details, and he wasn't going to let any detail slip away. Meanwhile, Sergeant Williams was having the most difficult conversation of her supervisory career. She had walked Rodriguez back to his patrol car, away from the cameras and witnesses, and was trying to understand how her department's newest officer had managed to create such a catastrophic situation in less than 4 months on the job. Rodriguez's explanation kept changing. First, he claimed he had received a call about suspicious activity, but when Williams checked with dispatch, no such call existed. Then he said Judge Smith had been acting nervously, but the video evidence clearly showed a calm, cooperative citizen. Finally, he fell back on the marijuana claim, insisting he had smelled drugs, but Williams knew this was desperate fabrication. The body camera footage would later reveal the truth, though Rodriguez didn't know it at the time. His camera had been recording from the moment he activated his emergency lights, capturing every illegal question, every inappropriate demand, and every false accusation he had made. The footage would become the centerpiece of multiple investigations and legal proceedings. By midnight, news of the incident had already begun spreading through law enforcement circles. Judge Smith had made several phone calls to colleagues and superiors, informing them of what had occurred. Word traveled quickly in the tight-knit legal community, and by morning, everyone from the police chief to the mayor would know that one of their officers had unlawfully arrested a federal judge. The police department's Internal Affairs Division received Judge Smith's formal complaint at 8:30 a.m. the following morning. The complaint was 12 pages long, meticulously detailed, and included timestamps for every violation of policy and law that had occurred. Judge Smith had also attached still images from his cell phone video showing his handcuffed hands and Rodriguez's aggressive posture. Rodriguez reported for his shift that Wednesday morning, not knowing that his career was already effectively over. His supervisor pulled him aside immediately and informed him that he was being placed on administrative leave pending a full investigation. Rodriguez would not be allowed to carry his weapon, wear his uniform, or perform any police duties until the matter was resolved. The investigation that followed was unlike anything the department had seen before. Usually, complaints against officers involved civilians with limited resources and legal knowledge. This complaint came from someone who understood exactly what laws had been broken and had the connections to ensure those violations were thoroughly investigated. Judge Smith's cell phone video was professionally analyzed by digital forensics experts. The neighbor recordings were collected and authenticated. Rodriguez's body camera footage was reviewed frame by frame. Personnel files were examined to identify any patterns of behavior. Training records were scrutinized to determine whether Rodriguez had received proper instruction on constitutional rights and appropriate police conduct. What investigators discovered was disturbing. Rodriguez had indeed received complaints during his short tenure, but those complaints had been minimized and dismissed by supervisors who assumed the complainants were simply unhappy about receiving tickets or being questioned. Nobody had bothered to look for patterns or provide additional training to address concerning behavior. The department's training records showed another problem. Rodriguez had completed the minimum required hours of academy training, but much of that training focused on physical skills, weapons handling, and report writing. Very little time had been spent on constitutional law, de-escalation techniques, or recognizing and controlling implicit bias. Judge Smith wasn't content to let the police department handle this internally. He filed a formal complaint with the state attorney general's office, requesting an investigation into potential civil rights violations. He also contacted the FBI's Civil Rights Division, providing them with all the evidence he had collected and requesting a federal investigation. The media attention began 3 days after the incident, when a local news reporter received an anonymous tip about what had happened. The reporter contacted Judge Smith's office for comment, and the judge agreed to an on-camera interview. He appeared calm and professional as always, but his words carried the weight of someone who had spent years fighting for justice. Judge Smith explained that this wasn't really about him personally, though what happened to him was certainly wrong. This was about a system that allowed undertrained, biased officers to terrorize citizens with impunity. He pointed out that if this could happen to a federal judge in his own driveway, imagine what was happening to ordinary citizens who didn't have his resources, knowledge, or credibility. The interview aired that evening and immediately went viral. Social media exploded with outrage over the footage, which clearly showed a respected judge being handcuffed in his own driveway for no legitimate reason. Legal experts appeared on news programs to explain the multiple constitutional violations that had occurred. Civil rights organizations issued statements demanding accountability. Rodriguez watched the news coverage from his apartment, realizing that his face and name were now known nationwide as the officer who arrested a federal judge for coming home from work. His phone rang constantly with calls from reporters, but his lawyer had advised him to say nothing publicly while the investigations were ongoing. The police chief held a press conference 4 days after the incident, announcing that Officer Rodriguez had been terminated and that the department was implementing immediate changes to training and supervision procedures. The chief apologized to Judge Smith and acknowledged that serious mistakes had been made, but many observers felt the response was too little, too late. Judge Smith's civil lawsuit was filed 2 weeks later in federal court. The lawsuit named Rodriguez, Sergeant Williams, the police chief, and the city as defendants, seeking both monetary damages and systemic reforms to prevent similar incidents in the future. The complaint alleged violations of the 4th and 14th Amendments, false imprisonment, assault, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. The city's insurance company immediately began settlement discussions, knowing that a jury trial